Happy Reformation Day. We celebrate Reformation today because it's the anniversary, 501st anniversary of Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Theses to the Castle Church door in Wittenberg. But in fact, the root of the Reformation is a much more private event. Luther tells the story about how he discovered the gospel, or the gospel discovered him, in his own words. This is in a preface to a 1545 edition of Luther's Latin works, and they asked him to write a preface, and in it he tells the story about the Reformation. I'll tell you how Luther describes it. Meanwhile, in the same year, 1519, I had begun interpreting the Psalms once again. I felt confident that I was now more experienced, since I had dealt in university courses with St. Paul's letters to the Romans, to the Galatians, and the letter to the Hebrews. I had conceived a burning desire to understand what Paul meant in his letter to the Romans. But thus far there had stood in my way, not the cold blood around my heart, but that one word which is in chapter 1. The righteousness of God is revealed in it, that is, in the gospel. I hated that word, the righteousness of God, which by the use and custom of all my teachers I had been taught to understand philosophically, as referring to formal or active righteousness, as they call it. In other words, that righteousness by which God is righteous and by which he punishes sinners and the unrighteous. But I, blameless monk that I was, felt that before God I was a sinner with an extremely troubled conscience. I couldn't be sure that God was appeased by my satisfaction. I did not love, no, rather, I hated the righteous God, who punishes sinners. In silence, if I did not blaspheme, then certainly I grumbled vehemently and got angry at God. I said, "Isn't it enough that we miserable sinners, lost for all eternity because of original sin, are oppressed by every kind of calamity through the 10 Commandments? Why does God heap sorrow upon sorrow through the gospel, and through the gospel threaten us with his righteousness and his wrath?" This was how I was raging, with a wild and disturbed conscience. I constantly badgered St. Paul about that spot in Romans 1 and anxiously wanted to know what he meant. I meditated night and day on those words, until at last, by the mercy of God, I paid attention to their context. The righteousness of God is revealed in it, as it is written, "The righteous person lives by faith." I began to understand that in this verse the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous person lives by a gift of God, that is, by faith. I began to understand that this verse meant that the righteousness of God is revealed through the gospel, but it is a passive righteousness. In other words, that by which the merciful God justifies us by faith, as it is written, "The righteous person lives by faith." All at once I felt that I had been born again and entered into paradise itself through open gates. Immediately I saw the whole Scripture in a different light. I ran through the Scriptures from memory and found that other terms had analogous meanings. In other words, the work of God, that is, what God works in us, the power of God, by which he makes us powerful, the wisdom of God, by which he makes us wise, the strength of God, the salvation of God, the glory of God. And I exalted this sweet word of mine, the righteousness of God, with as much love as before I had hated it with hate. This phrase of St. Paul was, for me, the very gate of paradise. Afterward, I read Augustine's On the Spirit and the Letter, in which I found what I had not dared hoped for. I discovered that he too interpreted the righteousness of God in a similar way, namely, as that with which God clothes us when he justifies us. So far Luther, and his own account of his discovery of the gospel. Happy Reformation Day.